The air at the Henderson Farm auction that April morning in '71 tasted of diesel exhaust, damp earth, and desperation. It was a smell Frank Miller knew well. It was the scent of a man's life being sold off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. Tractors that had turned the soil for a generation, combines that had harvested a lifetime of sweat. All sat in silent, orderly rows, their faded paint and grease-stained engines telling stories the fast-talking auctioneer would never know. Frank stood near the back, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas work coat. He wasn't here to buy a tractor. His John Deere 4020, a '66 model with the synchro range transmission, was paid for. It wasn't the newest or the biggest tractor in the county, not by a long shot, but it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of high-guard fluid in its veins belonged to him, not the First National Bank of Grafton County. That was a distinction that mattered more to Frank than horsepower or air-conditioned cabs. His eyes scanned the crowd, settling on Bill Thompson. Thompson was holding court near the auctioneer's truck, a flashy grin plastered on his face. He was 10 years younger than Frank and farmed like he was in a hurry to get rich or die trying. He'd just taken out a massive loan to buy the adjoining quarter section when Old Man Henderson went under, and he'd equipped it with the latest and greatest. A brand-new International Harvester 1066 sat gleaming in his yard, its red paint so bright it hurt the eyes. He farmed from inside a climate-controlled cab, listening to the radio, while Frank still tasted the dust of his own fields. Thompson saw Frank looking and gave him a condescending nod, the kind a man gives a stray dog. Frank just stared back, his face a granite mask, until Thompson turned away. The auctioneer moved down the line, his rapid-fire chant selling off plows, discs, and planters. Frank paid it no mind. He was here for one thing, a hulking mass of faded yellow iron sitting off to the side, looking more like a monument to failure than a piece of machinery. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6 crawler dozer. From the looks of it, a late '50s model. 10 tons of rust, seized metal, and neglect. The 6-foot blade was pitted and scarred, the hydraulic lines were cracked and weeping a dark, sticky fluid. One of the massive track springs was broken, letting the track sag like a tired old snake. A tin can was stuck over the exhaust pipe, but it had long since rusted through, letting years of rain and snow run straight down into the engine's guts. "All right, folks, let's move on to this." "Well, let's move on to this piece of equipment here," the auctioneer said, his professional enthusiasm faltering for a moment. "An Alice Chalmers HD6. She ain't run in a few years, boys, so we're selling her as is, where is. Good for parts, or maybe a man with more time than sense could get her going again. Who'll give me $500 to start? 500 for 10 tons of American iron." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Thompson guffawed the loudest. 500? You ought to pay someone to haul that scrap away, he yelled, winking at his buddies. The auctioneer ignored him. 500? Do I hear 5? Come on, boys. The blade alone is worth that in scrap. Who'll start it at 5? Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet, looking at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at the dead machine. Frank felt a strange pull. He thought of his back 40, that low-lying piece of ground near the creek that was more swamp than pasture. Every spring it flooded, drowning his young corn and leaving the soil sour and waterlogged for months. He'd gotten a quote from a contractor to dig a proper drainage ditch, a deep one that would channel the water back to the creek. The price had made him sick to his stomach. It was money he didn't have. But this dozer, this was a tool, a solution. It was a disaster, to be sure, but it was a disaster he could own. A problem he could solve with his own 2 hands, not with a signature on a bank loan. "I'll give you 300, Frank said, his voice low but clear. It cut through the murmuring. Every head turned to look at him. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. $300 from Frank Miller? I got 3, now who'll give 4? 400, boys. Let's keep it moving." Thompson smirked, stepping forward. 350, he said, not even looking at the dozer, just staring at Frank with a look of pure mockery. He was playing, trying to make Frank look like a fool. 400, Frank said immediately, his voice flat. 450, Thompson shot back, his grin widening. The farmers were watching now, enjoying the show. This was better than the auction. This was a contest of wills. The old way versus the new way. 500, Frank said, his gaze locked on Thompson. He wasn't bidding on a Dozer anymore. He was defending a principle. Thompson hesitated. The joke was getting expensive. He looked at the rust bucket, then back at Frank's stony face. He wanted to push him, to make him pay for his stubborn pride, but the thought of actually getting stuck with the thing was too much. He let out a short, sharp laugh and threw his hands up in mock surrender. He wants the anchor, let him have it. Go on, Miller, buy yourself a boat anchor. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Sold, for $500 to Frank Miller. You bought yourself a project, Frank. Good luck to you. As the crowd moved on, Thompson walked past Frank, clapping him hard on the shoulder. You just paid $500 for a scrap pile, you old fool. While you're playing in the mud with that thing, I'll be making real money with real equipment. Frank didn't say a word. He just watched Thompson walk away, then turned his attention back to his prize. He ran a calloused hand over the cold steel of the blade. It was rough, pitted with rust, but underneath it was solid. He looked at the seized engine, the busted track, the leaking hydraulics. Everyone else saw junk, a 10-ton anchor. Frank saw the future of his farm. He saw dry fields and straight ditches. He saw independence. It was a long road from here to there, a road paved with busted knuckles, greasy rags, and long nights in the barn. But it would be his road. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of bringing this old beast back to life, I gotta ask you folks watching, have you ever bought something everyone else called junk, only to prove them all wrong? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A car, a tool, a piece of equipment. I read every single one. Getting the HD6 home was the first battle. It took a lowboy trailer from the heavy equipment hauler in town, and $200 Frank couldn't really spare. They winched it onto the trailer, its dead tracks groaning and scraping against the steel deck. When they finally unloaded it behind his barn, it settled into the dirt with a heavy sigh, looking even more derelict and hopeless than it had at the auction. His wife, Mary, came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the Dozer, then at Frank, her expression a mixture of concern and weary faith. Frank, what in heaven's name is that? That, Mary, he said, unable to keep a sliver of pride out of his voice, is how we're going to fix the back 40. She just shook her head slowly and went back inside. The next Saturday, the real work began. The first order of business was the engine, the big Alice Chalmers Buda diesel. It was seized up tighter than a banker's fist. Frank pulled the injectors and poured a coffee can full of penetrating oil, his own secret mix of automatic transmission fluid and acetone, into each cylinder. Then he waited. For a week he let it soak, adding more each day, hoping the potent concoction would creep down past the piston rings and break the bond of rust. While the oil worked its magic, he turned his attention to the undercarriage. The broken track spring was a monster, a coil of steel as thick as his arm. Getting it out required a chain hoist, a torch to heat the retaining nuts, and a 3-foot breaker bar with a 6-foot pipe slid over the handle for leverage. When the last nut finally broke free, it sounded like a gunshot inside the barn. The new spring cost him $80, special ordered from a supplier in Milwaukee. A week later, he decided it was time to see if the engine would yield. He put the biggest socket he owned on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine and fitted the breaker bar and pipe. He pulled. Nothing. The bar bent under the strain, but the engine didn't budge. He put his entire 180 pounds into it, his boots slipping on the oily concrete floor. It was like trying to move a mountain. Thompson drove by in his new Ford pickup, slowing down to watch Frank straining against the pipe. He honked his horn and gave a sarcastic thumbs up before speeding off. Kicking up a cloud of gravel dust, Frank felt a hot flush of anger and shame, but he pushed it down. He let the anger become fuel. He reset his feet, took a deep breath, and threw his weight against the bar one more time. There was a sound, a low groaning creak from deep within the engine's iron heart. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Hope surged through him. He pulled again, and this time, with a horrifying shriek of tortured metal, the crankshaft moved a full inch. He worked it back and forth, a fraction of an inch at a time, for what felt like hours, soaking the pistons with more oil, feeling the resistance slowly, grudgingly give way. Finally, with a loud pop, it broke free. He could turn the engine over a full revolution. He had won the first, most important round. The following weekend, he pulled the cylinder head. It was a heavy, greasy beast of cast iron that took the chain hoist to lift. Just as he'd suspected, number 4 cylinder was a mess of orange rust and pitted metal. Water had sat in it for years, welding the piston to the cylinder sleeve. The violent act of breaking it free had scored the cylinder wall badly. It would need to be re-sleeved. The community's verdict on Frank's project was swift and unanimous. He was a fool. Men at the co-op would stop talking when he walked in, then start whispering and snickering when they thought he was out of earshot. Heard Frank still trying to raise the Titanic out there behind his barn, one would say. His neighbor to the west, a decent man named Charlie, stopped by one afternoon. "Frank," he said, leaning against the barn door and chewing on a piece of straw. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but you're behind on your planting. You're spending all your time on this thing. Maybe you ought to just cut your losses, sell it for scrap. You'd get your 500 back, maybe a little more." "I'll get to the planting, Charlie," Frank said, not looking up from where he was meticulously cleaning the gasket surface on the engine block. "This needs doing first." Charlie sighed. "All right, Frank, it's your farm." He left, shaking his head. The scorn was a constant low-grade fever, but it was the silent worry in Mary's eyes that stung the most. He knew she was thinking of the bills, of the time slipping away, of the neighbors' whispers. But she never said a word against him. Every night, she'd bring him a hot meal in the barn and sit on an overturned bucket while he ate. Her presence a quiet testament of faith that he clung to like a lifeline. It took him another month to finish the engine. He ordered a new sleeve, piston, and rings for the damaged cylinder. He rented a sleeve puller and spent a sweaty, frustrating day wrestling the old, rusted sleeve out of the block. He carefully pressed the new one in, using plenty of white grease and making sure it seated perfectly. He lapped all the valves by hand with grinding compound, replaced the head gasket, and torqued the head bolts down in the precise sequence the manual dictated. He rebuilt the leaky hydraulic pump for the blade, replacing every seal and O-ring. He flushed the fuel system, cleaned the injectors, and filled the radiator with fresh coolant. The day of reckoning came on a cool evening in late May. His corn was in the ground, late but planted. The barn was dark except for the single bare bulb hanging over the dozer. He bled the fuel lines, checked the oil one last time, and climbed into the worn steel seat. He took a deep breath. This was it. He hit the starter button. The big 24-volt starter motor groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly. 1 revolution. 2. A cloud of white smoke puffed from the open exhaust stack, smelling of penetrating oil and old diesel. He kept his thumb on the button. The engine turned faster, chugging, coughing. Then a single cylinder fired. Pop. Then another. Pop, bang. Suddenly, with a deafening roar, the Buddha diesel erupted to life, belching a thick cloud of black and grey smoke that filled the barn and billowed out into the night. It settled into a rough, clattering idle, but it was running. It was alive. Frank Miller sat in the seat, his hands resting on the control levers, and a slow grin spread across his face. The sound of that engine was the sweetest music he had ever heard. The years that followed were good ones for farmers. By 1974, the world had changed. The Russians were buying American grain by the boatload, and commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn that had been $2 a bushel was suddenly selling for $3, then $3.50. Soybeans were on a similar rocket ride. The Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butz, was on the radio telling every farmer in America to plant fence-row to fence-row. He told them to get big or get out. Bill Thompson took that advice to heart. He was no longer just a neighbor, he was becoming an empire builder. He used the soaring value of his land as collateral to borrow staggering sums of money. He bought out 2 more farms, expanding his operation to over 1,000 acres. He traded in his 1066 for a brand new International 1466, a turbocharged V8 beast that could pull a 7-bottom plow without breaking a sweat. He bought a new Gleaner N6 combine with a grain head so wide it had to be escorted down the county roads. He was the poster child for the new era of farming, aggressive, leveraged, and profitable. He'd see Frank at the grain elevator, waiting in line with his modest load of corn from his old gravity wagon, while Thompson's fleet of semi-trucks thundered in and out. "Still playing with that old 40-20, Miller?" Thompson would shout from the cab of his gleaming new pickup. "I spilled more grain this morning than you'll harvest all fall. You ought to sell that little patch of yours to someone who knows how to use it." Frank would just nod and watch him go. He didn't engage. He didn't argue. He just did his work. The high grain prices were a blessing for him too, but he saw them differently. For Thompson, they were fuel for expansion. For Frank, they were a chance to kill the wolf at the door. Every extra dollar he made went straight to the bank. He made double, then triple payments on his mortgage. He paid off his operating loan from the previous spring in a single lump sum. He started a savings account, putting away cash, building a fortress against the unknown. He spent his free time not at the implement dealer, but on his back 40 with the old HD6. The Dozer, which he'd nicknamed the Grunt, ran beautifully now. He'd painted the faded yellow metal with a few gallons of machinery enamel, and while it wasn't pretty, it was protected. He spent a whole summer with it, carving a deep, wide drainage ditch from the lowest point of the field all the way to the creek. He cleared out the thick brush and scrub trees that had choked the fence line for 50 years, pushing them into huge piles to be burned. He was adding acres to his farm, not by buying them, but by reclaiming them from the land itself. The back 40, once his worst piece of ground, was now high, dry, and fertile. He was increasing his yield per acre, not just his number of acres. To everyone else in Grafton County, Frank Miller was a failure. He was a man who had been handed a golden opportunity and had been too timid, too old-fashioned to seize it. At church potlucks, the other farm wives would talk in hushed, pitying tones about poor Mary Miller, whose husband was letting the world pass him by. Frank's kids got it at school. Thompson's son, a boy with the same arrogant swagger as his father, told Frank's boy, "My dad's buying a new Steiger tractor." "What's your dad buying? More rust?" Frank felt the isolation. He knew what people were saying. He saw the way the loan officers at the bank fawned over Thompson while treating him with a kind of polite condescension. But deep in his gut, he felt a profound sense of unease about the whole situation. Land prices were insane. Interest rates were starting to creep up, then jump. He'd listened to the news on the radio while he worked, hearing about inflation and oil embargoes, and the numbers just didn't add up. This boom felt fragile, like a beautiful sheet of ice stretched too thin over a deep, cold lake. One afternoon in the fall of 1979, he went to the bank to make his final mortgage payment. He handed the check to the young loan officer, a man named Peterson. "Well, Frank, this is it," Peterson said, stamping the paperwork with a flourish. "You're a free and clear man. Congratulations." "Thank you," Frank said, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders that had been there his entire adult life. "You know," Peterson said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "with your farm paid off, your borrowing power is incredible. We could set you up with a line of credit that would let you really expand. Bill Thompson was just in here last week. We financed a new 4-wheel drive Steiger for him. The sky's the limit right now, Frank. You shouldn't be afraid to use that equity." "I'm happy with what I've got," Frank said simply. "I think I'll just stay put for a while." Peterson shrugged, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "Suit yourself." As Frank walked out of the bank, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him, he saw Bill Thompson walking in. He wasn't alone. He was with the bank president, and they were laughing, their arms slung over each other's shoulders like old friends. Thompson caught Frank's eye through the glass. He stopped laughing, and his face hardened into the familiar smirk. He tapped the bank president on the shoulder and pointed at Frank, and they both started laughing again. Frank turned and walked to his truck. He didn't feel anger, just a deep, chilling premonition. He started the engine and turned on the radio. A grim-voiced newscaster was talking about interest rates, about a man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed to run the Federal Reserve, and about his promise to whip inflation no matter what the cost. Frank looked back at the bank, at the laughing men framed in the window. The sky might be the limit for them, but he knew that clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy, smelling of rain and ruin. And he had a feeling that the anchor everyone had mocked him for buying was about to become the only thing that could keep his farm from being washed away in the coming storm. The first sign of trouble arrived not in a letter from the bank, but on the wind. It was the summer of 1981, and the sky over Grafton County had turned a strange, hazy yellow. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey pavement. Corn leaves, which should have been broad and green, curled inward on themselves, looking like brittle, dying cigars. The air grew thick with the fine dust of topsoil, a constant reminder of the wealth that was blowing away with every gust. Frank walked his fields in the evenings, the cracked earth crunching under his boots. His corn was suffering, no doubt, but the deep roots, nurtured by years of careful soil management, were still finding moisture. It would be a poor crop, not a failed one. He had his savings. He could weather a bad year. Bill Thompson was not so lucky. His 1,000 acres were a monument to modern agriculture, planted fence row to fence row with hybrid seed that demanded water and nitrogen in massive quantities. He'd torn out the old windbreaks and drainage ditches to make room for his massive equipment, and now there was nothing to stop the wind from scouring his fields bare. The strain began to show on him. The easy grin was gone, replaced by a permanent anxious squint. Frank saw him one afternoon at the co-op, arguing with the manager over the price of diesel fuel, his voice tight and raw. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the west, one August afternoon, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. It wasn't a rainstorm, it was a tempest of wind and hail. Frank and Mary watched from their porch as the first icy stones, the size of marbles, then golf balls, began to fall. The sound was deafening, a roar like a freight train, as the hail hammered the metal roof of the barn and shredded the leaves from the ancient oak tree in the yard. In 20 minutes, it was over. The ground was white, and the air was strangely cold. Frank's corn was battered, but it was on the eastern edge of the storm's path. It would survive, though the yield would be cut in half. Thompson's land, directly in the heart of the squall line, was annihilated. His fields looked as if they'd been leveled by a giant machine, the cornstalks smashed into a tangled, rotting pulp. The storm had also washed out the main access culvert to his largest set of grain bins, leaving a 10-foot gully where the road had been. 2 days later, Frank was out on his 40-20, cultivating a patch of late soybeans when he saw it. Thompson's brand-new Steiger Panther, the four-wheel drive behemoth he'd bought on credit, was sitting motionless in the middle of a field. Frank watched for a while, then drove his tractor over. Thompson was standing beside the machine, his hands on his hips, staring at a puddle of hydraulic fluid spreading in the dirt. "Trouble?" Frank asked, shutting down his own engine. Thompson didn't look at him. "Cracked a hydraulic line to the main steering cylinder, a high-pressure one. Dealer says they don't have one in stock. Have to order it from the factory in Fargo. Could be a week." "A week?" Frank said. The word hung in the air. A week of downtime in a critical season was a disaster. "Yeah, a week," Thompson spat, kicking one of the massive tires. "This thing's got more wiring and hoses than a damn spaceship. $150,000, and it's dead in the water over a $20 hose I can't even get to without a special set of wrenches." He finally looked at Frank, and for the first time, Frank didn't see arrogance in his eyes. He saw raw, naked fear. "The bank's coming out tomorrow to assess the hail damage. I gotta get that culvert fixed, get the trucks in and out. I got a payment due at the end of the month that would choke a horse." Frank looked past him, toward the washed-out road. "I could fix that for you." Thompson stared at him. "With what?" "The Dozer," Frank said simply. A flicker of the old Thompson returned. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "That piece of junk? It'll probably break down halfway there." Frank just looked at him, his face unreadable. "My price is a tank of diesel and a case of beer. Take it or leave it." Desperation won out over pride. Thompson swallowed hard and nodded. "Fine, do it." The next morning, the familiar clattering roar of the Buda diesel echoed across the valley. Frank rumbled down the county road on the old HD6, its steel tracks clanking on the pavement. He spent the entire day in Thompson's field, working the Dozer. He pushed tons of earth, reshaping the gully, building up the roadbed layer by layer. The grunt, as he called it, performed flawlessly. It was a simple machine. There were no complex electronics, no delicate hydraulics. Just raw, brute force, controlled by a series of heavy steel levers that Frank worked with practiced ease. By late afternoon, the road was rebuilt, wider and stronger than it had been before. Thompson stood watching, silent, as Frank finished the last pass. He walked over, carrying a case of beer. He set it on the track of the Dozer. "Thanks, Miller," he mumbled, not meeting Frank's eyes. "No problem," Frank said, climbing down from the seat. He was covered in grease and dust, but he felt a deep satisfaction. He grabbed a bottle of beer, twisted the cap off on the edge of the blade, and took a long drink. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The 10-ton monument to his stubbornness, sitting there idling, its job done, said it all for him. The fall of 1982 was the quietest harvest anyone could remember. The usual hum of activity, the roar of combines, the rumble of grain trucks, was subdued. The chatter on the CB radios was gone. The grain elevator, normally a hub of gossip and good-natured ribbing, was as somber as a funeral home. The numbers were brutal. Corn prices had collapsed to below $2 a bushel, less than the cost of production for most farmers. And the interest rates, the ones Paul Volcker had unleashed to slay inflation, had soared to 18, 20, even 21% on operating loans. It was a death sentence delivered by certified mail. The farm crisis wasn't a wave that crashed. It was a tide that rose slowly, inexorably, drowning everything in its path. First, it took the young farmers, the ones who had just started, their dreams turning to nightmares of debt. Then it came for the aggressive expanders, the men like Bill Thompson who had bet the farm on the belief that the good times would never end. The bank that had once courted Thompson with easy credit now treated him like a pariah. The friendly loan officer, Peterson, was gone, replaced by a grim-faced man from Des Moines who spoke only in terms of assets and liabilities. Thompson's massive land equity, the foundation of his empire, had vanished as land values plummeted by more than half. He was upside down, owing far more than his farm was now worth. Foreclosure notices began to appear in the county paper like obituaries. The Henderson farm, which Thompson had bought with such fanfare, was the first of his properties to go on the auction block. Then another quarter section. He was selling off his empire piece by piece, not to expand but to tread water. But the tide was still rising. Frank watched it all with a heavy heart. He was safe. With no debt and money in the bank, he was an island in the middle of a raging flood. His thrift, once a source of ridicule, was now his salvation. While his neighbors were selling off their cattle to make a tractor payment, Frank was butchering his own hog, and Mary was canning vegetables from her massive garden. They were living lean, but they were living on their own terms. The final blow for Thompson came in the spring of '84. The bank called his entire note due. He had 30 days to pay off a sum that was impossible. The auction was set for a Saturday in April, almost 13 years to the day since the Henderson auction where Frank had bought the Dozer. The air that morning was cold and damp, mirroring the mood of the crowd. It was the same crowd mostly, the same farmers, their faces just carved with more lines, their shoulders stooped a little lower. But the feeling was entirely different. There was no excitement, no thrill of a bargain. There was only a grim, sorrowful silence. They were all there to witness the public execution of a man's life's work. The machinery was lined up in perfect rows, just as Henderson's had been. But this was not the equipment of a bygone era. It was a fleet of modern marvels, gleaming red and green and yellow, the massive Steiger Panther, the Gleaner N6 Combine, a whole line of late-model International Harvester tractors. It was the dream inventory of any farmer in the county, and it was all being sold to the vultures. Frank saw Bill Thompson standing near the farmhouse, a hollowed-out shell of the man he once was. His wife was beside him, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. He wasn't holding court. He wasn't laughing or slapping backs. He was just standing there, watching his world being dismantled. The auctioneer started, his voice lacking its usual boisterous energy. The bidding was slow, hesitant. Prices were shockingly low. The crisis had wrung all the cash out of the local economy. No one had money to spend, and the banks weren't lending. A 5-year-old tractor sold for a quarter of its value. The big Gleaner Combine went for a third of what Thompson had paid for it. It was a bloodbath. Frank didn't bid. He just watched, his heart aching for a man he had never much liked. but whose plight he understood completely. He understood the shame, the feeling of failure that went bone deep. He saw his neighbor Charlie, who had advised him to scrap the Dozer all those years ago. Charlie caught his eye and gave a slow, sad shake of his head, a silent admission of who had been right and who had been wrong. Then the auctioneer moved to the last piece of property, the original Thompson home quarter section. The 160 acres that had been in his family for 3 generations, including the house, the barn, the very ground they were all standing on. "All right, folks, here it is," the auctioneer said quietly. "The home place, 160 acres more or less. Who'll start the bidding?" A man from an out-of-state insurance company, a corporate buyer who had been snapping up distressed farms all over the Midwest, opened the bidding. Another speculator countered. They went back and forth, their voices clinical and detached. They weren't bidding on a home, they were bidding on an asset. Frank saw Thompson's wife start to cry, a quiet, desperate sound. Thompson put his arm around her, his own face a mask of stone. Frank felt something shift inside him. This wasn't right. He thought of his own farm, paid for with a lifetime of sweat. He thought of the quiet pride he felt walking the land that was his, truly his. To see a man lose that, to have it picked apart by strangers. "I'll bid 100,000, Frank said. His voice was steady and clear, cutting through the cold air. Every head turned. The corporate buyer looked at him, annoyed. Thompson stared at him, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. The buyer upped the bid. Frank countered immediately. They went back and forth, the price climbing in agonizing increments. The crowd was silent, watching the two men. It was no longer an auction, it was a duel. The out-of-state corporation versus the local farmer. Finally, the price reached a point where Frank knew he was paying more than the land was worth in the current market. He was bidding with the savings he had so carefully accumulated, the fortress he had built against this very storm. The corporate man bid again. Frank took a deep breath, looked at Bill Thompson, at his wife, at the house their family had built. 142,000, Frank said, his voice ringing with finality. The corporate buyer paused. He scribbled on his notepad, did the math, and shook his head. He was done. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking the silence. "To Frank Miller." A quiet sigh went through the crowd, a collective exhalation of relief. Frank felt a wave of dizziness. He had just spent nearly every dollar he had in the world. He walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers, his hand shaking slightly. Later, as the crowd was dispersing and the buyers were arranging to haul away their grim trophies, Frank saw Thompson walking toward him. His face was unreadable. He stopped a few feet from Frank. "Why?" Thompson asked, his voice rough. "Why'd you do it, Miller? To gloat? To finally rub my nose in it?" Frank shook his head. "No, that's not it." He paused, searching for the right words. "No man should have to watch his home sold out from under him like that. It ain't right." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper he'd had his lawyer draw up the day before, just in case. It was a rental agreement. "I'll rent the house and the home 80 acres back to you. The price is $1 a year. You farm it, you keep the profits. When you get back on your feet, you can buy it all back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. Not a penny more." Thompson stared at the paper, then at Frank. His eyes filled with tears. The first crack in his stone facade. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, a convulsive, jerky motion. He took the paper from Frank's hand, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't. But in that moment, the long, bitter rivalry between the two men died, replaced by something quiet, profound, and deeply human. Frank just nodded back and walked away, leaving Thompson standing alone in the middle of the farm that was, against all odds, still his home. The years that followed were slow and healing. The farm crisis eventually receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the community. Some farms vanished forever, absorbed into corporate holdings. Others, like Frank's, survived. The story of the Thompson auction became a local legend, a tale told at the diner and the co-op. Frank Miller, the stubborn old fool with his pile of junk, was no longer seen as a relic. He was seen as a prophet. Young farmers, starting out in a world of caution and tight credit, would stop by his barn. They wouldn't ask for advice on the latest hybrids or chemical applications. They'd ask him how to rebuild a water pump, how to set the timing on an old diesel, how to weld a cracked frame. He'd show them, his gnarled hands moving with a slow, sure confidence. He taught them not just how to fix machines, but how to be independent of them. Bill Thompson became a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He and Frank became friends, an unlikely but solid pairing. They'd help each other during harvest, sharing equipment and labor. It took Thompson nearly 10 years, but one crisp autumn day, he walked over to Frank's house with a cashier's check in his hand and bought back his farm. They shook hands on the porch, two old survivors who had seen the worst of it and had come out the other side. One Saturday afternoon, years later, Frank was in the barn with his son, David, who was now a young man with his father's steady eyes and capable hands. They were working on the old HD6 Dozer. It needed a new set of seals in one of the final drives, a greasy, heavy job. "You know," David said, wiping his hands on a rag, "I was talking to Billy Thompson's kid. He said his dad told him this dozer saved their family." Frank stopped turning his wrench and looked at the old machine. Its yellow paint was faded and chipped, its massive blade scarred from decades of work. It looked ancient, a dinosaur from another age. "Well," Frank said slowly, "it wasn't just the dozer. It was what it stood for." He pointed at the machine with his wrench. "That thing taught me a lesson. When you buy something with cash, when you can fix it with your own two hands, it's yours. It works for you. But when you borrow a fortune to buy something shiny and new, you don't own it. It owns you. And its real owner is the bank." He looked at his son, his gaze intense. "Remember that, David. Your wealth isn't in the size of your barn or the color of your tractor. It's in that space between what you have and what you owe. The bigger that space is, the freer you are." David nodded, understanding. Frank smiled, a rare, wide grin. "All right, let's get this seal seated. We've got a fence line to clear tomorrow." He picked up his wrench and went back to work. A few minutes later, David climbed into the operator's seat. "You think she'll still start, Dad?" "Only one way to find out," Frank said. David hit the starter button. The big motor groaned, turned over twice, and then, with a familiar deafening roar, the Buddha diesel engine exploded to life, belching a puff of black smoke toward the rafters of the old barn. The whole building vibrated with the raw power of it. It was the sound of stubbornness, the sound of survival. It was the sound of Frank Miller's legacy, a 10-ton lesson in iron, rumbling on for the next generation.